Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on database DevOps. Hope you are all staying safe and healthy. My name is Noor Basha, Marketing Director at Winwire Technologies, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. As you all know, today's topic for the session is database DevOps, where we will discuss how to accelerate application delivery. So in the next 30 minutes, what we are going to do is that we are going to discuss how to implement a database DevOps solution using Azure, basically to improve the efficiency of database management and overall increase the efficiency of database to their database release and thereby having a considerable advantage for your customers. So before that, let me quickly highlight few housekeeping items. During the webinar, please feel free to post questions and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end. We are recording this session and we'll be sharing the recording in next 24 to 48 hours. So with that, let me introduce you to today's session speaker, Vidya Ashok. She is the Senior Director of Data Platform at Winwire Technologies. Vidya leads the pre-sales team at Winwire from offshore with specific focus on data and AI. She comes with 20 years of experience in data and analytics space, spanning clients across multiple industries, and she has played a major role with large and global organizations like Microsoft, Hexaware, Oracle, to name a few. She's a like passionate learner and believes that continuous learning is given and has to stay invested in this process to grow. So that's what Vidya is all about. And with this, let me hand it over to Vidya. Vidya, over to you from here.
Thank you, Noor. Welcome everyone for today's session. So let's look at the agenda first and look at the various topics what we are going to discuss today. So we'll get started with an introduction to DevOps. I know DevOps has been there in the industry for quite some time, so it doesn't need a detailed description, but we will just start with DevOps in order to set the context. We will look at the typical application development pipelines, or how DevOps is being done as part of application development, and how it is not being done at the database side of it, and what are the various challenges which is being faced in the industry with respect to the database DevOps side of it. Also, once we cover these challenges, we want to essentially give a solution to it, right? So how we can actually evolve database DevOps within our organization and accelerate the overall application development cycle as such. Towards the end of it, we'll have a QA session, and please do post your questions. We'll try to answer as much as possible. So with that being the agenda, let's look at the definition, right? So any software, be it an ASP.NET solution or a C# or a web app or any mobile app also, right? So any software you build, it goes through a life cycle of being built, testing, and then the release process. And this involves multiple people within the overall life cycle as such. In the past, when we had actually done the different methodologies, it was all in silos, and the need for more collaboration between the application development team, the quality assurance, the system integration, it became a very much essential or mandatory, and that's when DevOps evolved, right? It's basically the union of people, process, and products, which enables continuous delivery. And that is what is the value add which any of our customers would require. So that being the definition, now how actually it is being implemented, right? So if we look at the typical application development, what happens in it, right? So this is a generic and the modern flow, which is what I have put together, considering the DevOps which is being fairly followed in today's software industry. Some of the principles which are followed. So you see that the development is on the left hand side of it, right? The development is on the left hand side. In between we have the continuous integration, and then towards the end we have the operation. So basically, the developers develop the code, everything is moved into a version control system, and then once the development is completed, the unit testing has to be done. And how it is done is using the continuous integration process. So this is primarily like, the developers, they build the code, they use a version control system where they actually primarily move in the code and then take that out to make some changes or share these to other developers, and also capture any specific functionalities what they are trying to achieve by building the code. Right. So once the development is done and it is being stored in the version control, what happens is, the next step is move on to the continuous integration process. What happens here is basically an independent validation and verification of code is done. And then the feedback is given to the developer so that if there are any changes to be done, any additional functionalities to be included, or if something has been missed out, so that feedback is given to the developers, and they can make the necessary changes and move back the code into the repository so that the same cycle continues. So why this has become imperative, or why this is important, is because the code built once has to run anywhere. It's not that I build a code and it runs in my machine, and whereas when I send it across to you, it doesn't run, right? So that is not what is expected out of it. So that is why we need a continuous integration process. Now, once the code runs successfully, what is the next step? We need to publish it into an artifact repository, and that is what you see here. After the continuous integration process, we have the artifact repository. And how these artifacts are published, it could be in any format depending upon the kind of application which is being built, right? It could be an exe file, it could be a DLL file, a jar file, and potentially this is what has to be released to the customer as a form of a complete build. So this code build is primarily deployed to the release management software, which again goes through multiple layers, right? Which is the QA, it could be the staging or the beta testing, and finally into UAT and then the production stage. So this is an overview of how DevOps is being followed in an application development lifecycle, right? So now let's take a look at how it is currently done, or being done in the database side of it, and how can we envision the database DevOps side of it. So this slide basically talks about how we need to envision the database development lifecycle as such. So it is quite similar to the application development lifecycle. However, the catch is that most of the industries or even the kind of projects which is being done, application development and database development is treated quite differently. So what happens is, while we have developers, DBAs or developers who are writing SQL code or any kind of stored procedures, who are working on the database side of it, they do work on these codes, but the problem is centralized version control is something which is missing from a database side of it. So what happens is, these are small codes, so people try to build, and they always try to take help from the DBA, right? So I have made this change, so can you just include this in the next build? So that's how the interaction takes place, and it's quite manual. And of course, the DBA is a human being, right? So he obviously would tend to forget things and miss out on certain things because it is a manual process. So it's kind of, this is what actually causes things being left out, or any changes, small changes being left out from a database side of it, and it breaks the application side as such. So what we are trying to do is basically see how we can actually incorporate DevOps in the database side of development. So similar to the application side of it, we need to have a centralized repository where all the code is stored, and then implement the continuous integration process where we have the build, test, feedback loop, publishing it into the artifact repository, and finally moving it into the next level of QA, UAT, and production. But there are different challenges in actually doing this. And when we have to embark on this journey of database DevOps, what is it that we got to do, right? So that is something which we will go through in the next few slides. So how do we evolve the database DevOps side of it? First of all, environments. We need consistent environments, in the development side of it, in the UAT or production also. We need, all the three environments need to be consistent enough so that the code once developed in one set of environment needs to seamlessly run on the other environments also. So the first and foremost requirement is on the environment which needs to be provisioned. The second one is consistent data sets, right? So across the dev, build, and test, right? We need for the specific use cases, the data sets which needs to be provided for unit testing or system testing. It all needs to be consistent across all the different environments of the database development as such. The other important aspect is basically functionality testing. So the basics are being done, syntax is being checked, whereas the overall, there are a few things which gets left out. So as per the use case, a lot of importance has to be given to the unit testing side of it at the development phase itself. Also, another important aspect is on the security and compliance. Typically, what happens in a database lifecycle is that while we test it for the functionality or the kind of use case what we have taken, often the security and the compliance aspects of it is actually left to the production side. So people, what they do is they do not include it as part of the dev or the UAT side of it. Only when the code is moved into production, the security aspects or the compliance aspect is taken care. But that has to change. So it has to shift to the left, which means that we have to start including the security and compliance test right from the beginning, which is basically when the developers are actually developing the code itself. When we talk about compliance, it's basically GDPR or the Australian or Japanese Privacy Act, where we have PII data, right? So we need to take care of the sensitive data. It needs to be protected. So it has to be classified. It has to be only present in the production environment. We need to mask it at all the other environments. So that is something which is important. So that needs to be brought in at the dev layer itself. Now, the next step, once we have all the environment and everything ready, the next step is to go to the version control. So this is a very important step here, because we need to have a repository where all the code is available all the time. It's not dependent on the individual developers into their machines as such, right? So treating the database code similar to the application code is very, very important. And only then we can actually move into the database DevOps side of it. So many organizations are adopting to various version control tools today, and it could be in the application and the database code can be placed in the same repository, or you can have a separate repository. That's according to the organization policy or something. But it is very important to have a tool where we can actually store all the code, and it is very important also to organize this code into multiple folders and subfolders, so that it is very easy to manage the code at a later point of time. So in case organizations are not using any specific or standard version control tool, or it is client dependent, right? That there are various situations which happens like that. If there are no tools, then the best recommendation is to go about using Git. Distributed and centralized is another big debate wherein which one to use, right? There are both pros and cons for a distributed version control system and a centralized control system. But these days, with everything moving into cloud, be it Azure or Amazon, distributed is what is making sense, because code is available in the cloud, and you can actually take it out and pull the request and make changes as and when required. So high availability is something which is key over here. Another important thing when we are using the version control is to take care of the branching flows. Some of these branches, they are very short-lived, and some of them are long-lived. So we need to kind of strike a balance between when to use what. Now that we have a version control tool, now how do we actually go about applying version control on a SQL code, or a database code, right? So we have data definition language, we have data manipulation language. So how do we do that? So the first and foremost step is to capture the DDL and DML into a version control system. And this is typically a text file, right? So when we actually build all the code, we do it with the tool, and tools today have the capability of converting them. For example, SQL Server, the SSD is what we use, right? So we can actually convert them into text file, so that it becomes very easy to move it into the VCS. And then once it is moved into the version control system, always use pull request for any kind of code review or changes to be done, right? So it's very important to follow the process. Now, specifically when we do the coding process, you basically write the code, the convert the code in the DDL or DML into a text file. You commit it into a VCS, and whenever there are changes to be done or any kind of reviews to be done, the best practice is to use a pull request. It's very important to include comments, so that anybody can understand what is being done. And the other important thing is the comments in this section, basically on the version control system, needs to be done to emphasize on why the changes were made and not what changes are being made. So that is something which is important to be taken care also. There are a lot of tools today, in terms of version control, when we have to move the database definition languages or a manipulation language. There are a lot of tools which are being used. So typically, depending upon the organization standards and even the client, what they want to follow, can follow them. But it is very important that a version control mechanism has to be established. Let's look into continuous deployment, right? So but once we have the version control in place, now what next? So today we have a lot of templates. We will look at SSDT because, from an Azure standpoint, how do we actually go about considering SQL database? How do we actually go about replicating the database objects into different environments? So we have the database definition. We use the SSDT. So if you see on the top of the page, what we have is basically the output. Once we have created a project, right, and the database DLL and CML, the output of your SSDT is basically the tag pack. Now, once we create this script, it is very easy to replicate them across multiple environments, be it a local environment, to the dev environment, QA, or the production. So that's how it has to go through. Now, there are project templates which are available for continuous deployment. You can actually find them in the Microsoft website. as well. So you can actually go about downloading those project templates. So this is a sample of a continuous deployment project template. So you can see that we have the required code, for example, static tables, how we can do that. There is a pre-deployment update code. There is a post-deployment update code. Right? So what is the kind of order execution when we actually go about doing a project deployment using SSDT. So it's basically we have the pre-deployment updates, then we do the schema updates. The schema updates basically, whatever is generated by the tool itself. Then there is static table merges, and post that we do the post-deployment updates. How do we go about doing continuous integration? We did see some of the steps before. This is again, uh, uh, an easy way to look at it, right? The application code. Basically, you need to integrate the database code with the application code also. So typically, the application code uses continuous integration to build, test, and package the code. Then you have compliance. Compliance needs to start early, like we spoke about earlier. Then the database build happens, and once the database build is there and it's stored in the version control tool, as a next step, we need to kind of build it using any kind of tools today which are available. It could be Azure DevOps or a Bamboo, Jenkins, right? There are multiple tools which are available. Here are some steps when we use Azure DevOps, right? Once you have the code in the repository, as the next step, you go to Azure DevOps site, you open up the pipelines within the Azure DevOps site, and then you kind of follow this process of building the solution. So the different steps over here is basically you need to copy the files to a staging directory, right? You specify the version, you specify the name, where is the source folder, right? The contents of it, everything, and then you publish this artifact, what is available. Once the artifact is published, which is the build or the code build, you can release it, right? You have a release pipeline and you can go about releasing it, the code to different environments. When we go about database testing, some of the key things which needs to be taken care of, right? Test needs to be automated. Uh, uh, Manual testing process is cumbersome and there is a lot of misses over here, and that is one of the primary reasons why we want to go about doing uh, automated testing. There are different types of test, right? So we can do the standard test, static coding test, logical unit test, and multiple frameworks are also available in terms of SQL Server. And that is what we have actually listed some of the tools. So based on the projects and the customers whom you are working with, you can definitely choose those frameworks. Some of the steps, right? Once you have the code and you need to update it, how do we go about doing it? So the code includes stored procedures, functions, views. So everything together is packaged, and you can just take the latest version from the version control tool. However, uh, when it is a table, right, you need to use a comparison or the migration scripts to make changes, because table might exist earlier. It might, you need to kind of, you cannot just drop the table and then create a trigger in the next level, right? You need to have the table in the first place. So that's why we need to have a SQL compare, which basically compares, between the different environments, what are the different objects which exist earlier and which it doesn't exist now. So there are different comparison tools which are available. We can use as Redgate has provided SQL Compare. We have SSDT. There are also different migration tools, for example, SQL Change Automation, FlyWayDB, right? So we can use these scripts in order to compare. What are the different approaches to implement changes in the database? So there are two basic approaches. One is called the declarative and the other one is called the imperative. So declarative is basically the state-based approach. So in this case, what happens is basically we do the compare, right? Like we spoke about a typical case of a table being existing within a schema, right? So in you we basically use a tool, a SQL compare tool, to compare the dev environment and the production environment and see what is the gap there. So the tool actually finds out and then lets us know what is the basic difference. Whereas in a migration approach, right? So we create an incremental script or a set of scripts which are actually moved between different layers. So here we have actually put together a few differences between how the model or the compare based process works across different environments, be it the dev and what actually happens in the SQL compare and how it is actually done in the production environment, and also migration process. So in the migration process, what happens is we basically have the code created. For example, all these steps along with the order or the sequence in which the code has to be run, so that it can be replicated across the dev, QA, UAT, and the production environment. What are the pros and cons, right? So for the state, model, or compare, it is very simple for developers. The tool generates the script, so you can easily go about knowing the differences. The only or the important difficulty over here is the ordering of changes, right? So the tool doesn't provide a specific order in which the changes have made. So it's very difficult for a developer to go about finding out the tool ordering. Whereas in the migration approach, all the changes, right, whatever you have done, it moves through the multiple layers, and there is always uh, a control which is there, because you have the code which you have developed and that which can be used to replicate in the other environments. So here is the overall summary, basically DevOps principles to the database. Yeah. And yeah, so this is what we had to discuss in today's session. Noor, over to you for any questions.
Thanks, Vidya. Thanks for the informative session. Yes, I do have a few questions coming from the audience. The first question that's there from John is basically, I think this is very basic question. What is the difference between DevOps and DataOps? If you could just throw some light on that, I think that would be helpful.
Sure. So DevOps has been around, like we discussed earlier. It's basically collaboration between developers and the testing side of it, or the operations side of it. But of late, we also have data ops. This is a key word which is emerging. And this is primarily what is data ops is. It's an automated process, right? It is used by specifically by the analytics or the data team who work in and out on the data project. And it helps to improve the quality of code and also to reduce the cycle time of the overall data analytics. So that's primarily the difference between data ops and the DevOps.
Thanks, Vidya. For another question, this is from Mark again, is like, is there any right stage to start automation of database?
So automation, like we spoke about, is something which is very key, because manual intervention often introduces a lot of errors, and we want to kind of totally eradicate that. So any stage within the database development lifecycle or application development cycle, automation can be introduced at any stage. So what happens is it enables the control, and it makes the deployment process repeatable, reliable, and consistent. So it is like as early as possible. If you start, that's the best way to kind of go about DevOps way.
Thanks, Vidya. This question is from Uday. Here is like, can we do SSIS packages and SSRS report build and release through DevOps pipeline in DevOps server? So hope I'm clear. If not, I'll repeat that again.
If he's asking that if you can do it together, so right, so we have a set of pipelines, the SSIS integration packages, and we have the reports as such. So can we actually do them together?
Yeah, I think it's not together. Basically, he meant those needs to be done separately.
Yeah, separate is definitely possible.
Okay. Uday, I hope that answers your question. Great, thanks. I think he's fine with the answer. The other question what I have is are there any key metrics that needs to be considered for continuous delivery of database?
Oh yes, there are multiple metrics which can be considered, right? To begin with, there is always a deployment downtime. It could be, because of backups, which is basically the time that the system needs to be offline, right? So first thing is we need to measure the deployment downtime. Secondly, once it is we have a backup, right? So it has to restore from a failed backup. So there is a time of recovery. How much time does it take for it to restore from a failed deployment or something? That's the second metric. And probably, many times what happens is there are multiple applications which share one common database. So there is always, when you actually share databases, we are increasing the blast radius. So the database becomes unavailable, right? So we need to kind of take a note of all the affected applications. So according to me, I think these are the very common metrics from a database DevOps standpoint.
Thanks, Vidya. I think that's really helpful. I know like we are almost at the end of the time. I do have few questions from the audience. Probably we will take them offline in the interest of time. Uh, Vidya, if you could just move to the next slide, I would just want to quickly talk about the next webinar that we have on March 25th, which is about understanding common development of framework. And that is again on March 25th at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So you guys can go ahead and register on winwire.com/webinars. Thanks again. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar. Hope you find it informative. And if you have any questions or clarifications, please reach out to us at marketing@winwire.com and we will take those questions offline. Thank you, Vidya. Thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.